home alone feels safe, until you hear the floorboards groan like they're carrying weight, step by step, dragging closer, even though no one else should be here. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. The first thing I noticed that night wasn't the sound, it was the silence. A silence so heavy it felt like a blanket pulled over my head, thick and suffocating. Houses have their own language, I reminded myself. Wood groans, pipes clatter, foundations sigh. But this quiet was unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the hum of my own pulse in my ears, until the first knock broke through, a hollow thud beneath the floorboards. I froze, convinced I'd imagined it. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Old houses settle, beams shift like joints popping in a tired body. But when the second knock came, sharper this time, I felt it reverberate through my feet like a tuning fork struck against bone. My skin prickled. There was no wind outside, no storm rattling the frame. The night was calm, yet inside the house something moved with intention. I leaned forward, pressing my palm against the cool wooden boards, and felt a faint tremor beneath them. It was absurd, I told myself, but it felt like a pulse. The smell arrived next, faint at first, then unmistakable. Damp earth, like the air after rain. But there had been no rain that week. The odor reminded me of turned soil at a gravesite, the raw scent of what lies beneath. I tried to rationalize, maybe mold, or moisture from an unseen crack in the foundation. Still, when I inhaled, I felt as if I were breathing in the memory of something buried, something restless. The knocking grew deliberate, like a code tapped out by unseen fingers. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2. Each sequence matched my breathing pattern, as though something below was timing its rhythm with mine. I tested it, held my breath, then exhaled slowly. The next knock came only after I released the air. That's when panic clutched me. This wasn't coincidence. It was a response. I tried to stand, but the weight of dread pinned me down. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I remembered stories of subterranean acoustics, how sound travels through soil and wood, how even a tiny shift underground can mimic footsteps. But science didn't explain why the knocks mirrored me like an echo that chose when to answer. A part of me wanted to flee the room, to run outside into the cold night air where the silence might feel honest again. But another part, the darker, curious part, needed to know. I tapped back, once, gently. The boards felt icy under my knuckle. For a long moment, nothing. Then a slow, dragging knock answered, directly beneath me. My stomach dropped as if the floor itself had exhaled. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but curiosity sharpened like a blade. I leaned closer, ear nearly pressed against the boards. The wood creaked under my weight, and I thought of coffins, of the thin barrier between the living and the dead. Was I listening to the house, or was the house listening to me? The next knock didn't come as a tap. It came as a shudder, violent enough to rattle the lamp beside me. I jerked back, heart thundering. The floor no longer felt solid. It felt like a lid that something beneath was testing. And with each knock, it seemed more determined to open. But what if it already had? I didn't run. I gathered small things that might anchor me to reason. A flashlight, a moisture meter, and my phone with a vibration app I once downloaded. Set on the boards, the graph flickered like a pale heartbeat, lines jittering in sympathetic fear. I tapped twice, gentle as a question, and watched the waveform settle. The smell of wet soil swelled, a cold breath I hadn't known the house possessed, and the boards cooled beneath my hand. The knocks returned, patient and almost polite. 3, a pause, then 2, mirroring the pattern braided through my pulse. I tried to map it like Morse, dots and dashes unfurling toward meaning, but the timing kept adjusting to me, as though I were the metronome it tuned itself against. The flashlight skimmed the varnish like a slow comet, and, in that small galaxy of dust, I felt watched. What could calculate me this closely without eyes or breath? It made me think of my father, who taught me the bones of this place and the codes of panic. When storms bullied the roof, he tapped 3, 2, 1 to make me laugh. His hands were hammers, his humor a level keeping me steady. After he died, the attic felt like a sealed sky. Grief seeped through the framing like groundwater. I tapped his rhythm now, a ritual for the living. The reply matched, impossible yet clear. I followed the sound to the hallway register where the return vent inhaled the home's stale air. The grill was gritty with paint, the screws refusing like bitten lips. Cold air poured through after I pried it loose, smelling of dirt and old insulation. I lowered the flashlight and the beam found the crawl space. A shallow cathedral of joists and pipes, dark earth laced with roots. The underside looked like a rib cage, each beam a bone holding something. I slid my arm into the opening and set the phone on a joist. The accelerometer jumped again. Something down there didn't thump so much as swell, a pressure change like the sea pressing a submarine hull. Soil shouldn't move like that without water or breath. I scraped my knuckles on the edge, the sting, immediate. What I didn't expect was heat, faint and steadily radiating from a patch of earth, as if the ground flushed at discovery. Curiosity outweighed dread, a reckless algorithm I never managed to debug. I slid a putty knife between two loose boards and levered gently. The plank lifted with a groan, exposing lath and a seam darker than imagined. My phone camera, shoved into the gap, returned a jittery window of soil pulsing in the dark like a sleeping animal. On the spectrogram, two rhythms braided, mine fast and ragged. Another, slower, older. Which of us was entraining the other? The knocks aligned with thought, not touch. The pattern shifted a breath before I did, like an opponent anticipating a move I hadn't chosen. Prediction requires memory. Wood remembers. Pressure and earth holds prints. I widened the seam and uncovered a copper tube, dull as coin, its mouth buried like a reed. I lifted it to my ear. Warm air exhaled a shape like my name. The soil flexed inward, once, twice, waiting. What was asking to be let in? The first time I noticed it, I thought my eyes were simply tired. I'd been staring at my laptop screen too long, the glow searing shapes into my vision. When I looked up, the curtain at the far end of the room carried a shadow that didn't belong. It leaned across the fabric like spilled ink, stretched too long, bent too sharp. Outside, the street was still, the lamppost humming its lonely filament song. No one stood on the sidewalk, yet the silhouette remained. I tried to laugh it off, muttering excuses into the stillness. Shadows play tricks. The brain fills in blanks with monsters. Scientists call it pareidolia, the same instinct that makes us see faces in clouds or saints in burnt toast. My body, however, didn't buy the science. The hair on my arms bristled, goose flesh marching across my skin as though my body recognized a truth my logic rejected. I stood there, heart pounding like a metronome offbeat, waiting for the shadow to dissolve. It didn't. Instead, it moved. Not quickly, not even dramatically, just enough to break the illusion of stillness. The curve of its arm bent where no body could bend, the limb warping like liquid ink stirred by an unseen hand. And then, unmistakably, that warped limb rose into the shape of a wave, a greeting or a dare. I stepped back, pulse hammering so loudly I thought the window might vibrate from it. Behind glass, I was supposed to feel safe. Glass is a border, a transparent wall. But in that moment, it felt less like a shield and more like a thin invitation. Card. Something fragile enough to be tapped, cracked, or ignored entirely. I pulled the curtain tighter, trying to shut it out, but the outline bled through even heavier, as if the fabric wanted to host its shape. I wondered if shadows needed light the way parasites need hosts. feeding on whatever they could cling to. I remembered my mother's old superstition: never sleep with a mirror facing your bed. She swore reflections opened doors. What would she have said about shadows stretched where no one stood? Maybe they were doors too, inverted ones, thresholds where light itself became complicit. I wanted to believe the shadow was only a distortion, an angle of the streetlight mixed with passing leaves, but the trees outside were bare, skeletal against the night. There was nothing left to sway. The sense of being studied grew heavier with each second, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against my chest. It wasn't the frantic stare of a predator, but something slower, patient, cataloging. As if the shadow were less interested in frightening me and more invested in understanding me. That terrified me more. Predators kill, archivists wait. I reached for my phone, considering calling a friend, but stopped. What would I even say? That darkness itself had grown a hand and waved at me. The thought of explaining it out loud felt absurd, yet my body wouldn't unclench, every muscle wound like wire. I inched toward the curtain, fingers trembling as they grazed the fabric. My heart whispered a warning I couldn't ignore, because the shadow wasn't content to stay still anymore. Its head, if that's what it was, tilted, not toward the street, my heel catching the edge of the rug, nearly toppling me. That tilt was too human to dismiss, too precise to be accident. Shadows shouldn't mimic posture. They are accidents of geometry, nothing more. Yet this one moved like an actor hitting his mark. I wanted to rationalize it as a trick of my heartbeat, the flicker of light syncing with my pulse, but the truth crawled beneath my skin. I was being watched, and the glass between us meant nothing. The room grew colder. Not the kind of chill a draft brings, but a sinking cold that seemed to seep from the floorboards upward, as though the house itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. I pulled the curtain wide open, desperate to reveal the source. The street was bare, washed in the sterile glow of the lamp. No figure, no movement, only the empty sidewalk stretching into silence. But when I turned back to the window, the shadow remained, darker than the street behind it, bold as ink spilled over the glass. That was when I remembered the experiments I once read about. How our brains sometimes project images into empty space during sensory deprivation. Staring into the same pattern too long, the mind invents details to stay busy, but my mind couldn't invent the sound that followed. A faint tapping against the pane, so delicate it could have been fingernails. One tap, then another. Not random. Rhythmic. My breath hitched as I realized it matched the same slow beat my heart had been trying to outrun. I pressed my palm to the glass, testing its solidity. The shadow shifted, pressing its hand to the same spot from the other side. A perfect mirror. For a moment it felt like standing at the edge of a deep well, the air carrying a pressure that made my ears ring. And I couldn't shake the thought. Perhaps the light outside wasn't casting this shape at all. Perhaps the glow was feeding it, pulling it closer with every flicker. Light is supposed to drive away darkness, but what if light is the lure, not the shield? Memories of my father returned, his lectures about how darkness is never an entity itself, just an absence of photons. I had believed him, clinging to the simplicity of physics, but tonight that comfort betrayed me, because absence shouldn't lean or wave or mimic the tremor in my fingers. Absence doesn't leave condensation trails on the inside of glass. And yet there they were, small foggy streaks spiraling where the shadow's hand touched. The thought struck me with surgical clarity. It isn't outside. It never was. The window wasn't a barrier. It was a stage. The real performance was happening here, inside, and I had been too focused on the wrong side of the glass. I stepped back, my reflection catching in the pane. For an instant, the shadow overlapped my outline, and I swore I saw its head turn again, aligning perfectly with mine. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a lifeline of sound in the silence. but when I glanced at the screen, the glow caught the window, and I realized with a shuddering certainty the shadow had learned to move even when the light did not, and it was still waving. The first sound was faint enough to dismiss. A whisper of weight above my head, so light it could have been imagined, like the brushing step of a cat exploring beams. But I didn't own a cat, and it was long past midnight. The attic above me was sealed, nailed shut years ago when the insulation grew brittle and dangerous. Still, that soft cadence persisted, padding back and forth with a rhythm that belonged not to creaks of wood, but to deliberate steps. My breath caught. I lay frozen in bed, staring up at the plaster, willing the sound to prove itself false. But denial has a cruel way of breaking down when dust begins to fall. Thin particles sifting from the ceiling, catching the faint glow of the nightlight like golden snow. I coughed, tasting the stale sharpness of fiberglass insulation, the flavor of a space untouched for decades. The house felt less like a shelter and more like a lung exhaling memories. Yet memories shouldn't walk. Memory shouldn't weigh down with every tread. The steps grew heavier, at first timid, now dragging with purpose. The joists groaned under invisible weight, as though beams designed for silence now hosted an intruder. I pressed my palm flat against the ceiling, the cool plaster holding steady beneath my hand, though vibrations tremored faintly like ripples in water. That was when instinct and science collided inside me. I thought of thermal expansion, of wood snapping with temperature change. Yet these sounds weren't random cracks. They formed a sequence, paced like a march. I rose from bed, my legs unsteady, and reached for the flashlight I kept on the dresser. Its beam slashed the corners of my room, slicing away shadows, yet leaving dread untouched. I aimed it upward, as if light could pierce through ceilings, but all it revealed was paint dusting loose flakes where time had chewed. The steps paused. Silence pressed down like a lid, and for one dizzying moment, I believed I had been heard. That was when the breathing started. Subtle at first, like the stirring of air trapped in insulation, then heavier, wetter, exhalations, seeping through the plaster, sinking uneasily with my own lungs. I leaned closer, ear almost against the ceiling, and swore I heard it. An inhalation, long and labored, followed by a rattle of release. Each breath dragged the night deeper, like ropes pulling something closer. My heart pounded so violently I feared it would betray me, drumming an invitation upward. The attic had always been a place of myth in my family. My grandfather, a carpenter, had once stored heirlooms there, tools, letters, even his war medals. But after he passed, the space was locked, boards hammered across the hatch as if sealing a wound. We told ourselves it was practicality, fiberglass too hazardous, wood too weak. But standing there, with dust raining from above and breaths filtering through, I wondered if we had sealed it for another reason. Perhaps some doors were never meant to be opened. Then came the sound that ripped all doubt away. A deliberate, dragging footstep stopped directly above my bed, heavy enough to shower me with debris. My flashlight flickered, sputtering like a candle in a storm. I staggered backward, choking on the dust, staring at the ceiling that now felt thinner than paper. And in the suffocating quiet that followed, the breathing deepened, as though whoever was up there had finally crouched down, ear pressed close, listening for me in return. I stumbled toward the attic hatch in the hallway, every nerve in my body pleading with me not to. The wooden frame loomed above, edges lined with cobwebs like strands of nerve tissue stretched too thin. I hesitated, flashlight trembling in my grip, its beam quivering over the hatch. For years, no one had touched it. The nails were crooked, rusted in place like forgotten stitches. But if something moved above, something breathing, then the seal wasn't as final as I had believed. The house groaned with age, a body cracking its joints in protest. I pulled the chair from the hallway corner, climbed cautiously, and raised. my hand to the wood. The hatch felt cold, as though the air above were made of stone cellars and not the heat-trapping rafters of an attic. My fingertips brushed dust thick as ash, and when I pressed gently, it sifted down in a stream, coating my wrist. The dust had weight to it, like the residue of years collecting into a skin. But beneath it was warmth, faint, steady, almost like the heat of a resting body. I should have climbed down. I should have fled the house entirely. But fear works like a magnet. It repels logic while pulling curiosity closer. I leaned harder, ear against the hatch. The breaths came clearer now, wheezing like lungs lined with paper. Inhalation, exhalation. And then, an unmistakable pause followed by something else. A rasp. A voice too soft to be words but full of intent. It wasn't random air moving. It was speech, muffled by inches of wood. I lowered myself off the chair, pulse erratic, and staggered back to the bedroom. Perhaps exhaustion was tricking me, layering sound where none existed, but the steps followed again, pacing the length of the attic with slow precision. Dust spilled in curtains, drifting like smoke in my flashlight beam. I swept the light upward, watching shadows form and dissolve like waves against a shore. Each time I blinked, I swore I saw something darker than shadow pause between the beams. My mind clung to science like a child clutching a fading blanket. Houses amplify noise, rodents gnaw wires, heat pushes joists, but none of that explained why the rhythm stopped when I stopped, or why the breaths matched the ragged stutter of my lungs. And none of it explained what came next. I sat on the edge of my bed paralyzed, when a single, violent thud struck directly above me. The ceiling bowed slightly, paint cracking in tiny lightning veins. My flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling across the floor until it stopped, beam aimed at the ceiling. In that cone of light, dust swirled like a galaxy forming, and in the center, the faint outline of a footprint appeared. Not in dust, but pressed outward from the inside of the plaster, as though something tried to step into my world. The breath above deepened into a growl, guttural and resonant, vibrating through the joists like a warning bell. I staggered backward, hand on the doorknob, debating flight. But before I could decide, another footprint bulged beside the first, stronger, heavier, as if weight was shifting from one foot to the other. And then, with a sound like a sigh tearing open, the wood above me cracked. Something wasn't waiting in the attic anymore. It was trying to come through the silence like a blade. I bolted upright, heart pounding, as the sound echoed through the house. A shrill cry that belonged to another decade. For a moment, I didn't believe it. The landline had been dead for years. Its cord coiled like a fossil in the corner of the living room, wires long severed. Yet at 2:13 a.m., its voice was unmistakable. One long metallic trill, followed by another, each note pulling me closer. I sat there in the dark, frozen, telling myself it was impossible. I hadn't heard that ring since my childhood, when it had been the heartbeat of the house. Back then, its sound meant gossip, news, laughter, and occasionally grief. But this was no ordinary call. There was no dial tone to wait for, no reason for it to live again. Still, my body carried me forward, as if drawn by muscle memory buried deep in bone. My bare feet met the cold floor, each step a question I wasn't ready to answer. The phone sat on the side table by the couch, its beige plastic stained with the passage of years. The cord curled into itself like a sleeping snake, dust lining the buttons. Yet it rang as though time had never touched it. Its sound sharp and commanding, louder than it ever used to be. I hovered over it, hand trembling. Logic clawed at me. Phantom calls sometimes bleed through, cross-wired signals from neighboring lines. But there was no line, no power, no life in its veins. The fourth ring tore through my hesitation, and I grabbed the receiver. It was cold against My ear, colder than any object should be indoors. For an instant there was nothing, just silence, so thick it hummed. Then the voice came. My name. Drawn out, syllable by syllable, as though spoken through teeth full of static. The sound wasn't human in the way a voice should be. It stretched, faltered, flickered like a candle flame burning in heavy wind. Yet the shape of my name was unmistakable, I whispered back, testing the air, my own voice small and ragged. The reply came immediately. My name again, but this time with a detail tucked inside, a memory only I could have known. It spoke of the toy I buried in the backyard when I was 6, the one I never told anyone about. My chest tightened, heat flushing through me even as the receiver stayed cold. I nearly dropped it, bile rising in my throat. Cross-wired signals couldn't carry my childhood secrets. The voice continued, each word unraveling slowly, like tape chewed by an old cassette player. I pressed the receiver harder to my ear, as if force could make meaning clearer. But the more it spoke, the less sense it made. Phrases tangled, half-formed images spilled into sound. I caught fragments of laughter, the scrape of something metallic, and beneath it all, the rhythm of a clock ticking. My stomach clenched. The clock was matching the one in the hall, each tick perfectly synchronized. And then came the worst part. The voice didn't just repeat my name. It asked me to come closer. The static bled into syllables that shaped the words "look outside." My hand froze on the cord. The receiver pressed so hard against my ear it ached. A draft whispered through the room, stirring dust like faint ash. My gaze drifted toward the window, curtains shifting with the breath of the night. What could possibly be waiting for me out there, tethered to a phone that shouldn't ring? I didn't want to move, but the command burrowed into me like a seed, sprouting dread that pushed me toward the window. The receiver still clung to my ear, the cord taut and coiled, as though it were tethering me to something deeper than the house itself. Static crackled on the line, the voice repeating softer now, more urgent, a rhythm between coaxing and demanding. Look outside. Look outside. My hand trembled as I pulled back the curtain. The street lay empty, bathed in the dull, orange haze of the lone streetlight. No cars passed, no neighbors stirred, no sound but the thin hum of power lines in the cold night air. Yet in the stillness, I felt watched, as if the darkness itself pressed against the glass with unblinking eyes. I searched the yard, the sidewalk, the quiet stretch of asphalt. Nothing. But the voice in my ear chuckled faintly, a sound like broken circuitry attempting to imitate amusement. I lowered the receiver, pulse thundering. Logic scrambled for purchase. Hallucinations can manifest under stress. Auditory pareidolia can trick the mind into layering voices over static. But what scientific law could explain what happened next? The way the porch light flickered, dimmed, and then pulsed in time with the sound of breathing on the line. The glow wasn't random. It beat like a heart, sinking with each hiss of the caller's exhale. I stepped back, my throat dry, when suddenly the voice spoke again, clearer, sharper, slicing through the fuzz. It didn't just say my name this time. It whispered my address, every number, every detail correct, each syllable pulled long as though savoring its precision. My knees weakened. This wasn't some distant signal bleeding through. Whoever or whatever, it knew exactly where I stood. I slammed the receiver down, but the ringing returned instantly, shriller than before, rattling through the walls like a fire alarm. The phone vibrated against the table, the plastic housing, shuddering as if alive. My instincts screamed to rip the cord out entirely, but the wires were already cut, dangling loose, useless. I grabbed the phone with both hands, desperate to silence it, but the sound didn't stop. It didn't even falter. The ringing had wormed its way past mechanics, becoming something alive in the air itself. And then, as abruptly as it began, the noise ceased. Silence crashed down like a wave, leaving my ears ringing in its absence. My chest heaved, the living room spinning in quiet disarray. I thought it was over, until I realized the receiver had grown warm in my hand. Slowly, I lifted it back to my ear, breath caught in my throat. What came through was no longer static. It was my own voice, not just the cadence of it, but the exact way I sounded when I whispered in fear. The echo repeated my words from earlier, looping them back at me like a cruel recording. Only now, the voice added something new, a faint, overlapping whisper just beneath my own. "I'm already inside." The line went dead. The receiver slipped from my grasp, clattering against the floor. And in the silence that followed, I heard a faint, deliberate click from upstairs, like another phone being set gently back on its cradle. It began like the faint rustling of fabric, so soft it could have been imagination. I paused halfway, down the hall, listening harder. The sound wasn't fabric, though. It was whispering, a low, measured murmur slipping out from the guest room door. The cadence reminded me of a chant, each syllable carrying the weight of rehearsal, like a prayer repeated for years in the dark. My skin prickled, the fine hairs on my arms standing up, though I told myself it was stress playing tricks. People, under pressure, hear things that aren't there. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The problem was that the door had been locked from the inside for months. The room had been unused ever since my cousin stayed over last summer and absent-mindedly jammed the key before leaving. I had never gotten around to fixing it, so the room remained a sealed box in the house, nothing but dust and furniture. And yet, here I was, frozen in the hall, listening to whispers that clearly came from within. I stepped closer. Each footfall seemed to pull the whispers into sharper focus, as though proximity was tuning a radio. The words blurred, slippery as smoke, but the tone carried a strange intimacy, like secrets traded under a blanket of night. I leaned closer, ear hovering inches from the wood, and for the briefest moment, I understood. My own name threaded through. The murmur carried softly, insistently, as if coaxing me toward confession. My chest tightened. No hallucination calls you by name. No stress-induced phantom can recite memories you've never spoken aloud. And yet I heard them, fragments of old shame I'd buried deep. My childhood fear of water, the way I once panicked in the deep end of a pool, swallowing more chlorinated waves than air. The whisper repeated it, shaped into a lullaby of humiliation. The sound wasn't hostile. That was the worst part. It was soothing, seductive, like a rope lowering into a well, promising rescue while coiling tighter with every word. I pulled back, heart hammering. Rational explanations swirled like storm clouds. Could the sound be coming from outside, filtering through cracks in the siding? A radio left on in the neighborhood? I pressed my palm against the door, feeling the grainy coolness of painted wood. The whisper shifted instantly, rising just above a breath, quickening as though aware of my touch. It was no longer a distant murmur, it was a voice pressed against. The other side, matching the rhythm of my breathing. The thought lodged in my mind. Maybe the door itself was the mouth. Its wood trembled faintly under my hand, vibrations syncing with the voice. I imagined the paint cracking open like lips, syllables bleeding out through splinters. The idea was absurd, but so was the sound of my secrets unraveling on the other side. I took a step back, shaking my head, forcing my voice into the stillness. I demanded silence, a plea swallowed instantly by the hallway air. For a moment, the whisper obeyed. The quiet was worse than the sound, like standing in the pause between lightning and thunder. My heart leaned forward, waiting for what came next. And then it came. The metallic clink of the handle rattling, once, twice, deliberate. My body froze, rooted in place. Whatever was whispering inside was no longer content to stay behind. Harder this time. Metal scraping against its housing with the impatient rhythm of a locked thing testing its cage. My mouth went dry, my pulse climbing into my throat as I watched it quiver. For a breathless second, I thought the mechanism might actually turn, that the simple lock I had trusted for months would surrender with a tired sigh. I took an involuntary step back, as though distance could dilute the reality that something inside wanted out. The whisper returned, louder now, clearer. Not just breath-shaping syllables, but words I couldn't mistake. My name, repeated, drawn out with tenderness that curdled into something more insidious. It didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded like me. The inflection, the quiet breaks. Between consonants, it was my own voice speaking back to me from behind the door. A cold weight pressed into my stomach as the thought rooted itself. Was the house replaying me, like a record stuck in grooves of memory? I fought the urge to scream, instead pressing my hand flat against the wall. The wallpaper was cold, the plaster beneath it steady, but the vibration threaded through, subtle as a heartbeat. I wondered if buildings could remember, if walls might. Trap the residue of voices, playing them back when the air grew heavy enough. My grandfather once claimed wood was porous, that it soaked up emotion like a sponge. He said that's why old houses never really went quiet. They just waited for someone to listen. Tonight I was listening, and the house seemed eager to perform. I braced myself, straining to make sense of the chant that had returned beneath my name. The syllables layered, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. Then, between the folds of sound, I heard something that didn't belong. A sob. A muffled cry, sharp and wet, like someone grieving on the other side of a confession booth. My chest constricted. No hallucination weeps. No trick of stress can conjure tears that cut so deep. Whoever or whatever was whispering knew sorrow, and it wanted me to join. The handle twisted violently, metal biting against its socket, but still the lock held. My instinct was to run, to barricade myself in another room, but my curiosity burned like a reckless flame. I leaned closer, eyes locked on that thin line where the door met the frame. The whispers softened, almost conspiratorial now, as if rewarding my proximity. I swore I felt warm air slip through the crack, brushing my face like breath escaping lips. I whispered back. I don't even remember deciding to. The words slipped out of me, trembling, fragile. Hello? The response came instantly. My name. Again, this time paired with a new phrase, two words whispered with undeniable clarity. Let me. The air in the hall thickened, pressing into me like a tide. I backed away, trembling, but my gaze refused to leave the door. The handle gave one final, furious jerk. Then, silence. No whispers, no sobs. Only the aching quiet of a house holding its breath. And then, from the other side, came the faintest sound of knuckles tapping wood. Not random, deliberate, as though the door itself was knocking, waiting for me to answer. The first flicker seemed harmless, a tired bulb, I thought, nothing more. But then it came again, sharper, deliberate, as though the room itself had taken a breath and exhaled in light. I froze, watching the overhead lamp pulse once, twice, then steady itself. At first I blamed the wiring. Old houses carry electricity the way aging hearts carry blood, stuttering, uneven, sometimes skipping. Beats. But as I stood there, I realized the rhythm wasn't random. It was sinking to me. My hand went instinctively to my chest. The lights brightened in tandem with my heartbeat, then dimmed during the pause. For a terrifying moment, the room became a mirror of my pulse. Each glow a throb of blood moving through veins. It was uncanny, like seeing your breath painted on. The air, an externalized version of something that should remain private. The longer I stared, the more certain I became. The house wasn't malfunctioning. It was listening. The blackouts grew longer, stretching silence across the room until even my own breathing sounded foreign. When the bulb flared back to life, shadows leapt across the walls, stretching grotesque shapes that seemed to linger just a fraction too long before fading. I blinked and the light blinked with me. A delayed mimicry, as though anticipating when my eyelids would fall. My skin prickled. Lights may respond to voltage, but never to vision. I remembered an article I'd read once about circadian rhythms, how the human body relies on light as a conductor, how even small shifts can trick the brain into rewiring sleep and thought. Scientists claim that people are tuned to patterns like clocks set to the sun, but tonight it felt reversed. I wasn't the one adapting to the light was adapting to me. I tried to test it. I tapped my finger against the desk in a simple rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the bulb dimmed in time, a heartbeat echoed by an artificial star above my head. The air thickened, humming faintly, as if the walls themselves vibrated with attention. My chest tightened with awe and terror, the way a child might feel realizing the monster under the bed has been listening all along. I staggered back, knocking a chair into the wall. The bulb flared bright, then dark, as if startled by my movement. Could electricity sense fear? The question was absurd, yet the house seemed to answer in kind, its shadows quivering like startled birds. I reached for the switch, flicked it off, then back on. But even in that act, I wasn't in control. The delay in the bulb's return felt intentional, calculated, like someone deciding whether to comply. And then came the worst revelation. The rhythm faltered. For the first time, the lights no longer matched my heart. Instead, they pulsed against me, another rhythm, slower, older, layered beneath my own. My ears strained, and in the silence I swore I heard it. A second pulse, hidden in the house's bones, reverberating through plaster and wood. 2 heartbeats now, mine and something else's, and with every flicker, the second grew stronger. Stood perfectly still, afraid that even the sound of my breath might feed the rhythm. The bulb above me glowed with a steady insistence, then dimmed, then flared, like the contraction of a phantom artery. My own pulse raced in panic, but the house's pulse remained slow, deliberate, patient. 2 rhythms, competing for dominance, filling the room with an unspoken duel. It felt less like I was inside the house, and more like I had been swallowed by it. The walls absorbed the glow, each pulse painting the plaster with a sickly breathing color. I thought of the circulatory system diagrams I used to study in school, the red and blue branching rivers of veins. Tonight, those diagrams weren't trapped in textbooks. They were alive around me. The wires in the walls felt like veins, each flicker of light a surge of blood moving through arteries too vast to see. What if the house wasn't just shelter? What if it had always been something alive waiting for me to notice? The air grew, oppressive, thick with static that made the hair on my arms stand. My mouth tasted of copper, as though electricity itself had crept down my throat. I forced myself to break the standoff, grabbing the lamp on the table and yanking its cord from the outlet. But the room didn't go dark. The ceiling bulb flared brighter, a mocking sun that refused to die, pulsing harder, faster, syncing with the house's heartbeat rather than mine. I stumbled back, chest heaving, trying to steady my breathing. My heart hammered, erratic, while the house's rhythm remained steady. For one surreal instant, I wondered if it was trying to train me, to pull my body into alignment with its deeper pulse, the way lullabies train infants to sleep, the way pacemakers enforce order on broken hearts. But what happens if the stronger rhythm wins? Desperation drove me toward the breaker box in the hall. My footsteps thudded, and with each step the light above me flickered, responding, anticipating. It was no longer mimicry, it was choreography, a duet in which I was hopelessly behind. I flung open the box, slammed every switch down into darkness. Silence roared, but the bulb still glowed, dim now, faint and ghost-like but undeniable. It pulsed once, twice, as if laughing at the illusion of choice. And in the faint glow, I realized something I hadn't dared to consider before. The rhythm wasn't confined to the wires. It was in the floorboards, the beams, the air between my lungs. I pressed my hand to the wall and felt it there, a slow, powerful beat, deeper than electricity, older than circuits. The pulse quickened, no longer patient. Each flash of light stretched shadows across the walls, bending them until they almost resembled limbs. The room wasn't merely alive, it was aware, and its awareness was sharpening on me. My body betrayed me, breath sinking in ragged gasps, each inhale mirrored by a burst of light. And then the rhythm stopped. The bulb burned steady, no flicker, no pulse, just silence, eerie in its constancy. For the first time all night I thought, maybe it was over. But as I turned toward the door, the hallway beyond erupted with light. Every fixture in the house glowing in unison, all pulsing together in one impossible heartbeat. The house had synced. Not with me, my grandmother's to me. A tall-backed rocker carved from oak that smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust. For years it sat in the corner of the living room, quiet, unmoving, a relic of the woman who once swayed in it as she hummed hymns that soothed the house into calm. After she passed, no one touched it. It became a shrine of sorts, a silhouette frozen in time. But lately, at 3 a.m., it had come alive again, rocking gently, creaking with the rhythm of a lullaby that no one was singing. The first time I noticed, I thought it was the wind. The curtains had been breathing in and out of the open window, and I convinced myself the draft had nudged the chair into motion. Yet when I closed the window the next night, sealing the air tight, the rocker still swayed. Slow at first, a hesitant arc, then steadier, like someone regaining confidence with every push. The creak carried across the room, weaving itself into the silence like an unwelcome refrain. I watched from the couch, body rigid, refusing to blink. Dust spiraled in the moonlight, floating lazily through the air, and as the rocker moved, the particles shifted in patterns, disturbed as though brushed aside by invisible hands. My skin prickled. Furniture holds memory, they say. Wood absorbs oils from touch. Fibers imprint the weight of bodies long gone. But whose memory was strong? Enough to make oak move as if alive? I told myself I was sleep-deprived, a mind tricked by its own exhaustion. But then the tempo changed. The rocker quickened, creaking faster, as though whoever sat there had grown impatient. It wasn't a steady rhythm anymore. It was eager, insistent, demanding attention. My throat went dry. The sound wasn't soothing. It was threatening, the kind of lullaby that doesn't lead to dreams, but to surrender. Memories of my grandmother came rushing back, the way she'd tap her foot when annoyed, the sharp look in her eye when she thought I wasn't listening. The rocker had always been hers. Yes, but this movement wasn't familiar. This wasn't her rhythm. This was something else, something restless. The arc of the chair grew wider, its legs clicking against the floorboards as though it might tip, forward completely. I half expected to see it crash to the ground, but it never did. It knew its limits better than I did. I inched closer, my breath shallow, heart racing. The air around the chair felt charged, not cold but dense, like standing, too close to a live wire. My hand hovered over the worn armrest, tracing the grooves my grandmother's rings had carved into the wood. The rocking slowed as if responding, easing back into that patient, taunting lullaby. The chair almost seemed to wait for me, inviting, daring. I pulled my hand back at the last second, stumbling into the coffee table with a thud. The sound echoed through the house, and for the first time, the rocking stopped mid-sway. The silence that followed was worse than the creaking, thick and suffocating, the kind of silence that feels like someone holding their breath in the dark. Then the chair leaned forward once more. Only this time, it rocked without returning, as though someone had just stood up. The chair stood still again, tilted slightly as if it had just been abandoned. My chest tightened, every muscle taut, waiting for the sound of footsteps to follow. The house remained silent, but silence is never truly empty. It has weight, and that weight pressed against me like a hand over my mouth. My grandmother's old rocker no longer looked like wood and fabric. It looked like a stage where something unseen had just risen to perform. I tried to summon courage through reason. Earthquakes cause subtle tremors, I told myself. Vibrations from trucks passing on the road can set loose objects swaying. But no trucks rumbled outside. No tremor shook the walls. And what rational explanation makes a chair pause mid-motion as if considering whether to stand? Science can soothe, but not when the evidence mocks it with precision. I stepped back, eyes fixed on the rocker's shadow cast long across the floor. The moonlight painted it larger than life, stretching into the corner like a figure looming, taller than the chair itself. Dust still drifted in the beam of light, but instead of floating, it spiraled, curling into shapes almost like breath. The air smelled faintly of lavender, my grandmother's favorite perfume, though no bottle of it remained in the house. The scent was sweet, haunting, and undeniable. I whispered her name into the silence, testing it like a key in an unfamiliar lock. The chair shifted in response, rocking once, then stopping dead still. My heart pounded. It wasn't grief, it wasn't fatigue. The chair was answering. My whisper had become a command, and the thought horrified me. Had I called something back, or had I only woken something that had been waiting for my voice? Dared a closer step, crouching to peer at the floorboards beneath. Scratches ran along the wood in small arcs, marks I hadn't noticed before. They weren't random. They were deep, etched from repetition, as though something had been rocking, far longer than the nights I had witnessed. How many years had this gone on without me noticing? How many times had that chair swayed in darkness while I slept unaware in the next room? A sudden sound broke the stillness, a faint thump from upstairs. I jerked my head toward the ceiling. The rocker responded instantly, creaking into motion once more, this time in sync with my racing pulse. The timing wasn't random, it was deliberate, matching me beat for beat, mocking the rhythm of my fear. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the table again, desperate to break the connection. But the chair wouldn't stop. It rocked faster, harder, the wood moaning under invisible weight. Shadows fractured across the walls, bending like limbs, reaching for me. The lavender smell thickened until it was suffocating. A sweetness turned cloying, choking. And then the rocker did something it had never done before. It tipped all the way forward, slamming onto all four legs with a crack that echoed through the house. I froze. The chair was still again, but the space in front of it, the place where someone would sit, felt suddenly occupied. And though the room was empty, I swear I heard the sound of someone exhaling, slow and deliberate, right beside me. It was the stillness that made it stand out. Nights in this house are usually thick with silence, the kind that presses down on you like heavy cloth. But silence has its own shape, and when something disturbs it, you feel it before you hear it. That night, lying in bed, I felt the shift first, like the air around me tightened. Then I heard it, a whisper, my name, drawn out in a hush that wasn't echo or dream, but deliberate. It slipped through the vent above my bed, soft as smoke, fragile as breath. I froze. The ducts hadn't carried air in years. The HVAC system was long dead, the vents nothing more than hollow ribs inside the walls. Yet here was a voice, faint but clear, knowing me. I sat up, pulse quickening, ears straining to separate the sound from imagination. And then it came again, steadier this time. My name repeated as though someone were crouched in the dark, lips pressed close to metal, waiting for me to respond. I slid out of bed, feet touching the cold floorboards, every nerve lit with dread. The grate loomed above, squares of rusted iron cutting moonlight into geometric shadows. I rose onto my toes, cheek pressed against the metal, the chill biting into my skin. "Hello?" I whispered before I could stop myself, the word trembling more than my voice. The reply was instant. Closer. One word, stretched and intimate, curling down the shaft into my ear. My blood iced. There was no hesitation, no echo, no mechanical stutter. It was conversational, direct, like a hand extending from darkness. I staggered back, heart thundering. Logic scrambled for explanations. Sound travels through ducts. Vibrations carry across walls. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a trick of acoustics. But neighbors don't know your name, and they don't speak it like a secret. And ducts don't carry voices when they haven't been used in years. I tried to convince myself I was overtired, my brain playing with scraps of memory in the dark. But the silence after that word was worse than the whisper itself. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. I could feel it listening, waiting, as though the house itself held its breath for me. The thought spiraled in my mind. Houses breathe. They creak. They shift. They exhale drafts through hidden cracks. But breath is not language. Breath is not intent. I paced the room, every board groaning under my weight, the sound absurdly loud against the suffocating quiet. My reflection in the window looked pale, distorted by moonlight, as though even my own image was listening from the glass. I turned back to the vent, the square of metal glowing faintly. Dust shimmered in the air beneath it, disturbed by no breeze. Still, I imagined lungs on the other side, drawing me in with every invisible inhale. And just as I dared to believe it had passed, the grate rattled faintly, like knuckles brushing against bars. Then came the whisper again. 2 words this time. Steady, deliberate, and hungry. Come inside. The words seeped into me like poison. Soft, almost kind, but laced with an intent that made my skin crawl. Come inside. The syllables lingered in the ductwork, echoing without actually echoing, as if the walls themselves wanted to carry the command. I stumbled backward until my legs struck the bed frame, forcing me to sit. The metal grate above remained unmoving, innocent in appearance, but the sound of it still to build some scaffolding of reason around what I'd just heard. Maybe a trespasser in the crawl space. Maybe a trick of memory, my own mind whispering back to me through the hollow corridors of fatigue. But reason is brittle when your body knows better. My skin tightened as though unseen eyes roved across it. My breath caught. It wasn't the idea of someone hiding in the vents that terrified me most. It was the certainty that whatever spoke had been there, longer than I had lived here. The house groaned. A long shiver through the beams and dust trickled from the vent like ash shaken loose. I tilted the flashlight on my nightstand, its beam sweeping upward, catching the grate in a pale glow. Tiny threads of cobweb trembled across the squares. No movement. And yet, as the light steadied, I saw the dust shifting in the shaft behind it, pulling inward as if something unseen had inhaled. The flashlight flickered at the same time, dimming for half a second, as though it too had been drained. My grandmother used to say that houses store voices. She believed every word spoken under a roof lingers, impressed like fingerprints into wood and plaster. Sometimes, she claimed, the house answers back. As a child, I laughed at her, thinking it was folklore disguised as wisdom. Now, sitting in that room with the flashlight trembling in my hand, I no longer laughed. If voices could be stored, then who or what was speaking mine back to me? The whisper returned, softer now, coaxing. Closer. The same word as before, but drawn out like a lullaby, patient and persuasive. It no longer sounded like a stranger. It sounded like family. The cadence mimicked my mother's tone when she used to wake me gently for school, pulling me from dreams with warmth. That was the cruelty of it, the familiarity. Something in the vent was stitching together the voices I trusted most, sewing them into a tapestry of deceit. I stood again against every warning screaming inside me, and reached up toward the grate. My fingertips brushed the cold metal, and for a breathless instant, I thought I felt warmth push back from the other side. A presence, living, deliberate. The urge to unscrew the vent surged through me, wild and irrational, like an itch under the skin. My nails scraped the rusted edge, searching for a way in. Then the voice shifted, lower, sharper, no longer coaxing, but commanding. Now. The word thundered through the hollow duct, shaking loose another cloud of dust that rained down across my face. I gasped, stumbling backward, choking on the taste of iron and age. The grate rattled violently this time, as though something inside had slammed against it, impatient to be let through. And in that trembling silence after, I realized the voice hadn't just been speaking to me. It had been answering something I hadn't said aloud. It wasn't asking me to come inside. It was warning me that it was coming out. It started with the hiss, a sound like air escaping from the lungs of the house. I had been half asleep on the couch, the glow of the clock declaring 2:41 a.m., when the television flickered alive. Its screen, once dark and reflective, erupted with static, black and white snow cascading in restless rhythm. I jolted upright, the remote still on the coffee table where I had left it, untouched. My first thought was faulty wiring. Old electronics sometimes bleed power after all. But then the static shifted. The chaos of grain bent inward, like dust gathering in a gust of wind, forming shapes too precise to ignore. At first it was only suggestion, a curve here, a shadow there. My brain eager to find patterns where none existed. Pareidolia, the same instinct that lets us see animals in clouds or saints in toast. But the longer I stared, the less it looked like coincidence. The fuzz began arranging itself into the outline of a face. Fragile, yes, but deliberate. Eyes, blooming first, then the faint suggestion of a mouth. I leaned closer, every hair on my body bristling. It didn't resemble a stranger exactly, but it didn't resemble me either. The face floated in limbo, shifting like water disturbed by ripples, never fully solid, yet never disappearing. It was human enough to unsettle me. My reflection should have stared back in the glossy dark of the screen, but this was no mirror. This face breathed with the rhythm of the static itself, blinking in bursts of noise and light. I remembered something I'd read once, about scientists capturing the whispers of the universe in static. The cosmic microwave background radiation, faint. Residue from the birth of everything, hidden in the hiss between channels. Static wasn't empty. It was filled with fragments of origins, coded messages scattered like ash across the cosmos. What if the face I saw wasn't a ghost or hallucination, but some bleed-through of reality itself? A signal from the deep fabric of space, condensed into the suggestion of flesh and eyes. The idea thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. The air in the room felt charged, my breath fogging faintly though the heater was off. I stepped closer, pressing my knees into the carpet, face inches from the screen. The eyes in the static seemed to sharpen, locking onto mine. I felt studied, examined, as though the noise wasn't accidental at all, but intentional arrangement. My reflection couldn't watch me back. This did. The face twitched. A mouth flickered into being, forming shapes not quite words, like a puppet forced into motion by invisible hands. My ears strained against the hiss, convinced I could hear something beneath it. A rhythm, a cadence, almost like speech coded. In the noise, my grandmother used to say that radios picked up voices from the other side, but this was different. This wasn't voices lost in the air. This was presence, raw and insistent, staring at me through the thin veil of static snow. I reached for the remote with shaking fingers, thumb hovering over the power button. My instincts begged me to shut it off, to sever the connection before it became anything more. But curiosity rooted me. I had the eerie feeling that if I looked away now, I'd miss something meant only for me. And then within the static, the mouth aligned for the first time, its movements sinking into clarity. Not noise, not suggestion. A single word formed with absolute precision, jagged through the hiss like broken glass. Wait. The word cracked through me like ice water, so clear it couldn't be mistaken for imagination. Wait. Not a suggestion, not a coincidence. It was command. My thumb hovered above the power button, trembling. I couldn't tell if the word was meant to warn me or lure me, but something in its sharpness pinned me in place. I lowered the remote slowly, the glow of the static spilling across my hands like pale fire. The face shifted again, fragments dissolving and reassembling, as though struggling to hold itself together. Eyes bloomed and collapsed into noise. Lips broke apart into storms of grain, but always it returned, more focused each time. It was building itself through the chaos, pixel by pixel, like a figure climbing out of fog. And with every second, its gaze sharpened until I felt it press against my chest like weight. I wasn't looking at the screen anymore. I was being looked through. I leaned closer without meaning to, heart hammering. My reflection ghosted faintly over the static, and for a fleeting instant, the two images overlapped, my features blending. My mouth aligned with its mouth, as though I were the one speaking from inside the static. I tore my eyes away, gasping, but the room around me offered no safety. Every surface seemed faintly illuminated by the glow, shadows bending unnaturally toward the screen. Beneath the hiss, I caught another sound. Faint, layered but rhythmic, like distant transmissions bleeding through static. It reminded me of listening to shortwave radio at night as a child, when voices from continents away would slip into the gaps of silence. Scientists called it signal bleed, but this felt closer, intimate, like whispers pressed directly into my ear. I tilted my head, straining, and for a terrifying second I thought I heard my name. I whispered into the noise, barely able to hear my own voice over the hiss. "Who are you?" The face convulsed, features shattering into jagged shards of light before reassembling in grotesque slowness. Then, impossibly, its lips moved again. The screen crackled, and the voice, low, fractured, almost mechanical, emerged. "I am here." My body locked in place, terror and awe colliding. The television wasn't just reflecting or broadcasting, it was conversing. And worse, it was claiming presence, here in my room, not some far-off frequency. My rational mind begged me to leave, to flee into the cold outside air. But something deeper rooted me to the carpet, needing to see what would happen next. The static grew louder, a roar of white noise flooding the room, vibrating in my teeth. The face leaned closer from within, its features sharpening, stretching until its eyes filled the screen. They weren't eyes of flesh, but something coated, pools of shifting black ringed in electric storms of light. My breath stuttered. I thought of cosmic radiation again, of signals born at the dawn of time still echoing now. Maybe this wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was older than ghosts. The mouth opened wide, static pouring outward in jagged bursts. And then, layered beneath the chaos, came words too deliberate to be coincidence. "Don't turn away." The screen flared, white, swallowing the room in a blinding flood. And for a split second before everything dissolved back into darkness, I swear I saw the face push outward, its features bulging against the glass, as if something on the other side was trying. Silence doesn't comfort, but suffocates. Every corner of the house seemed to lean in closer, pressing its weight against the walls of my room. I had been lying awake for hours, restless, replaying every odd sound I'd already dismissed as plumbing, or shifting wood, or the natural exhale of an old structure. Shadows had lengthened in unnatural ways. Whispers had teased the edge of my hearing, and static from the hallway radio had flickered on as if stirred by a hidden hand. Each disturbance had been unsettling, but not decisive. They felt like preludes, like the throat clearing before a final announcement. That announcement arrived in the form of 3 knocks, sharp, deliberate, carved into the wood of my bedroom. "Dorsu." I froze instantly, every muscle strung tight as if my body had already rehearsed this moment. The sound was unmistakable, knuckles against wood, steady, unhurried. The door had been shut all night, locked from my side. I had checked the hallway only minutes earlier, making sure nothing lurked there, Nothing prowled in the space that stretched between me and the stairs. Empty. The knock didn't care about my certainty. It came anyway, each rap reverberating through the doorframe like an echo down a canyon. My throat closed. Fear has a way of strangling reason, and all the earlier events, the shadows that bent the wrong way, the whispers stitched into silence, the television static that formed half words, suddenly arranged themselves into a single horrifying narrative. They hadn't been isolated moments. They had been stages, and now the performance had reached its climax. I wanted to call out, to demand an answer, but the words collapsed before leaving my tongue. My voice felt fragile, as if speaking might shatter something holding back on the other side. The room seemed to lean with me, walls flexing inward, air compressing in anticipation. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, pulse drumming, so violently that I thought the knocking might adapt to its rhythm. The seconds stretched. Then came another series, 3 knocks again, louder this time, almost impatient. The kind of sound that tells you the knocker isn't merely asking, but insisting. I tried to rationalize. Houses make noises. People dream vividly when overtired. Perhaps the sound came from somewhere else. The neighbors, the wind. But the door itself had vibrated under the pressure. I was sure of it. My hand shook as I reached for the lamp, flooding the room with pale yellow light. Shadows recoiled, yet the door remained unchanged, plain and wooden. A sentinel holding back a presence I could not name. A memory surfaced then, unbidden. My father once telling me that doors are thresholds, not walls. That they mark not only where one space ends and another begins, but where invitation separates safety from danger. Never open a door if you don't know who's knocking, he'd said. At the time, it was advice about strangers. Tonight, it felt like prophecy. I drew closer, bare feet brushing the cold floor, until I stood only a breath away from the door. My ear hovered near the surface, straining for sound beyond. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint and unmistakable, I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady, almost calm. And just as I pulled back, the knock came again. This time softer, gentler, like a fingertip tapping instead of knuckles. Not a demand, but an invitation. My hand hovered over the lock. My fingers trembled over the lock, hovering as if the decision itself carried weight enough to collapse the air around me. The soft taps echoed in my bones, gentler now, but infinitely more unnerving. There's a cruelty in patience, something that waits, confident you'll eventually surrender. I pulled my hand back and pressed my palm against the door instead. The wood was cool, but beneath that calm surface I felt a vibration, subtle as a cat's purr, steady as breath. Something was there, something alive. The silence after that moment expanded until it seemed to fill the room with its own body. My lamp's light flickered, stretching the shadows across the wall, distorting them into figures I tried not to recognize. I wanted to flee, to tear myself away and retreat into a corner where the door couldn't reach me. But some magnetic pull held me there. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity, sharp and poisonous, burrowing deeper every second. The knocks resumed, 3 again, but each one quieter than the last, until the third was barely audible. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined them, until I realized the sound hadn't stopped. It had simply changed. From knocking to scratching, thin, deliberate strokes along the wood, tracing a line just beneath the lock. My throat tightened as I pictured fingertips dragging slowly, testing, drawing invisible shapes into the grain. I whispered, almost involuntarily, a single question. Who's there? The scratching ceased. Silence pressed back so heavily, I thought my chest might cave. Then, from the other side, came the sound that should never have been possible. My own voice, whispered back at me, fragile, distorted, but undeniably mine. "Who's there?" The words collapsed inside me, horror folding over logic. How could it know? Was it mimicry? Echo? Or had something been listening long enough to learn the language of my breath, to steal the shape of my words? I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed frame, eyes fixed on the lock. The air tasted metallic, thick with static, as if the very atmosphere was charged by presence. Then came a new sound, not knocks, not scratches, a slow, twisting turn of the knob. The locked handle resisted, but it rattled in its housing. Metal, biting metal, straining against the thin boundary I had left between myself and whatever waited beyond. My father's words about thresholds surged back into my mind. Doors don't keep things out. They invite decisions. They force you to decide whether to hold the line or open it. The knob stilled. The air calmed. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then a final sound slid through the stillness, quiet and certain, pressed close against the wood. A whisper so faint it barely rose above breath. "Let me in." The lamp flickered once more, shadows convulsing across the room. I stared at the door, hand frozen halfway between the lock and my side, realizing the truth with a clarity colder than fear. The real question wasn't whether I would open the door, it was whether the door needed me to. Subscribe, if you dare.